One of the points of today will be to talk about blockchain, a little bit about my background. I came out of a technology background originally, but have been working in the marketing and packaging space for over 20 years. So some of my time was standard multi-channel marketing, early on advertising, and then later digital marketing. But I'd say the bulk of my career at Chalk Incorporated and largely at Blue, has been in technology surrounding packaging and packaging art workflows. So what we're going to do today, we'll move to the next slide, and the question on the next slide is blockchain, hype or real value? And one of the questions you might have even had today when you were coming to the webinar, is this something I really need to worry about, or is it just something I can wait, and if it really catches on, I'll kind of lock in then, but for now I'm really busy. So I'm going to talk about the urgency around blockchain. Not that you've got to implement something tomorrow, but I think it's wise for anybody in this space to keep their eye on blockchain and to look for a couple of opportune places that they could start a POC or have a project, or at least have conversations with your peers about how blockchain might impact your brand or your company or your supply chain. So the next slide we have was kind of meant to be a little bit raw and kind of point out how basic even the term blockchain is. I've got a stack of blocks on the left, and then I have chains hanging around possibly an Italian person's neck. I say that with my wife being full Italian, so no apologies, I guess, needed there. One thing I'd like to point out about blockchain is, in this very simple example, if you look at the stack of blocks on the left, and you've got your ABC block that you probably looked at when you were 3, if I took that B out and I substitute another letter like a U or a T, it would be obvious to anybody watching this presentation that there was something out of order, something wrong. And so in the rest of the presentation today, we're going to talk about that, how if you substitute a fake block or a false block or the wrong block, that the chain itself can verify the data by saying that it doesn't match. The block we would substitute wouldn't match numerically with the A or the C, and it would be a forgery, and those who are participating in the blockchain could know and throw that U or that T out and regenerate a block until they had the B and the chain was intact again. On the next slide, we've got some physical representations of a digital currency. Many of you have probably heard of Bitcoins. And Bitcoins were simply a single use case that could use the blockchain as a platform. So typically we have Bitcoins being represented as intangible or non-physical value, but there are companies as small as pizza shops who will accept this digital currency and take in exchange for pizzas. In fact, you may know one Bitcoin I think is worth right now around $5,000 or $6,000, so you can get quite a number of pizzas with a Bitcoin. But the idea is that rather than going to a bank or using a government, we're using a system that's essentially owned by a group of computer users to trade value from a vendor to a consumer. And that really brings us to our next important point. We can go on to slide 6, and there's a very simple quote here that just says, blockchain represents the commoditization of trust. And so that's going to be one of the most important notions that we're going to talk about today. Where is trust today? Is trust something that can be commoditized? If I do the build on this slide, we'll see iconic representation of 3 areas we've typically placed trust in. One might be a lauded bank, like a Wells Fargo bank that's been around 175 or almost 200 years. The next is a government. It could be the government of the United States. It could be the government of Venezuela. It could be the government of Russia, but a government agency that people or institutions themselves have placed trust in. And then the last one might be a retailer, a store, Walmart, or something else. So these represent places that my generation, I'm 54 years old, my generation and the generation before me had placed trust in. But what's happened is people have realized, and I think particularly millennials and younger have realized, these institutions have let them down. Governments have ulterior motives. Banks have ulterior motives. You might have read in the news recently that Wells Fargo itself, one of the most trusted financial institutions in the history of the United States, has been accused and has actually admitted guilt and paid fines for defrauding consumers. Sometimes things as simple as pushing checking accounts that weren't needed. I think yesterday I read a scandal about brokers at Wells Fargo Investment pushing the wrong types of investments and basically taking unnecessary fees for consumer. The bottom line is that we can't always trust these giant organizations. I can also mention Facebook, where Mark Zuckerberg had to go before Congress to talk about why Facebook betrayed the trust of hundreds of millions of users by sharing their data in an authorized fashion with different agencies, I think lobbying agencies. So if these institutions are not fully trustworthy, is there another place we can put our trust? And how would that happen? So what we'll talk about today as we talk about blockchain is the fact that blockchain distributes the trust typically across a community or a network of users who have a vested interest in the chain. So blockchain is probably the most visible through Bitcoin, as I mentioned. There's even thousands of Bitcoin miners. And each time a block is finished, a block would typically be a set of transactions of Bitcoins passing from one person to another. That block gets calculated in a race by these thousands of miners. And once one miner wins the race by solving an algorithm, all the other miners then have algorithms to verify that block is true. So we don't have to have a bank or a government say that block is true. The community, this distributed community, is making that statement. What we'll do now is we'll move into the next slide, and we'll talk about the popularity of blockchain and blockchain as a search on the Internet. So what I've got on the screen are some searches that I did just to sort of gauge what the current interest level is in blockchain in the United States. And what you see on the left is a search I did on the word blockchain on Google. And you see there's a peak around Christmas because blockchain was kind of going a little bit crazy around Christmas. Then immediately after that, I did for the same range the word Bitcoin and blockchain. So blockchain is in blue, but you can see the interest in Bitcoin was so high that it sort of made the blockchain search irrelevant in comparison to Bitcoin. I also noted that the highest search was in Washington, D.C., and my guess there was that maybe our government is working very hard to try to regulate these technologies, and that's why search is high in D.C. That's a total guess. And on the next slide, just to kind of keep the whole thing grounded with popular culture, on the next slide, you'll see in the color yellow a new search. And my slide hasn't changed. There it is. Okay. And so here I just searched for LeBron James just to keep it honest, and you can see that LeBron James is searched way more, particularly at the end there on the right towards the NBA Finals, way more than blockchain and Bitcoin combined. So I kind of use this as just a quick finger to the wind gauge of what people are thinking about, and I think it's largely in technology space that people are looking for these terms. On the right, you see something called a hype cycle, and a hype cycle is a term, I believe, coined by Gartner, which studies technology and technology adoption. And basically, all technology adoption kind of work on the same idea that first, nobody knows about it. You could think of the Internet or iPhones or other things that the people on this call have adopted in this way. You first start hearing about it, then you hear a lot about it, then you hear so much about it, you're kind of sick of it. It's just on every billboard, ad, and conversation, and that represents the peak of the hype cycle. And then what happens is it starts to crest and come down, and it starts to get to the reality of the matter where people who are really implementing are talking about it, people who find real value in talking about it. And then it sort of doesn't meet the hype, and you get in this area at the bottom of the curve there that's called the trough of disillusion, where you're like, this technology isn't doing what it promised. It doesn't quite work. I don't know why people are so hyper about it. And then after that, it kind of smooths out. So if I take the iPhone, I remember all the hype. I went to WWDC. I saw Steve Jobs stand up with the iPhone. I was amazed. I was agog. And then later, I had one. It was good, but it didn't even really work that well as a phone. It was sort of a better tiny computer than a phone. But then over time they kind of worked it out, and now I have an iPhone, and it's pretty cool, and I like it. And that's kind of more towards the right, somewhere between the hype and the disillusionment. So the next slide just kind of shows where blockchain is now. So Gartner would say we've peaked the hype, and now we're sliding down the back into the trough towards disillusionment. And then we'll get some good implementations, and I'll talk about some real-world implementations in a minute and figure out where we can really use this stuff. Okay, next slide, Karina. So one question I get, in fact, last when I presented this, isn't this just a fad that will go away and I can just kind of forget about it and not worry, and then if it gets to be a big deal, I'll worry about it then? So kind of put a bunch of fads on here. Many of them have come and gone. I've got blockchain in there as the little block with the question mark. Personally, I don't think blockchain is a fad. One reason, I don't think I'd be doing a webinar on it if it was a fad, because it wouldn't look good in about a year. But I think this thing is here to stay, and I'm going to explain why in the next several slides. And Karina, go to the next slide. So these are all these fads, and then if you're in branding or retail, the next slide is about retail, and the question here is about retail itself and whether retail itself might actually be a fad. And one metric to underscore this is retail a fad? Will people keep shopping in malls? Will they go to grocery stores? Will we just sit home and shop on Amazon and order stuff through virtual reality clothing stores, et cetera, et cetera? If you look at this next slide, you'll see some metrics that are retail, and you'll see all of the retailers, JCPenney, Macy, Dillard, Nordstrom, Sears, Kohl's, all of them stacked along the bottom, and then you see the revenue of Amazon, and this timeline starts in 1985 and ends last year. And what you see is in the last 3 years, Amazon's revenue has largely eclipsed the revenue of traditional retailers. But that's not to say all is lost in retail. I think retailers are adapting and fighting back and trying to figure out how to make shopping a destination again and an experience rather than just, I need some tomatoes, I'm going to the store to get tomatoes. So don't think of this as the end. To me, think of this as the middle of the story, and we're waiting to see how are retailers going to respond to that. Are they going to want to continue to drive feet into brick-and-mortar stores? And I believe the answer is yes there, but I think we're going to have some upheaval and disruption first. So let's go back to the whole Bitcoin notion itself and think about whose eyes we're looking at Bitcoin through. So on the next slide, I've got kind of some personalities, and when you hear Bitcoin talked about in the marketplace, think about which personality is speaking. So we've kind of got the typical, I guess I put tech weenie on my outline. So is the person just purely interested in the technology and they really don't care if it works, as long as they play with the ones and zeros and it's got cool algorithms, then let's do it. And then the next guy we have in the line is somebody who's more of a banker or a private equity firm owner, and this person is thinking, how can we make some money with this gig? Could I get people to invest in it? Would they invest and my business would fail, or is blockchain really here to stay and I'm going to make money from investors so they give me some more money so I can make some more money? And then the third personality is the CEO. So these are heads of companies like Maersk or Albertsons retailer or Procter & Gamble or Unilever, and they're worried about blockchain and is there something my competitors have that I don't, and what's it mean to me, and do my vice presidents and directors know anything about it, and how can they keep making me look like I understand it and like my company's with it. We go to another person, the kind of guy with the stereotypical yellow hard hat who I have representing a logistics manager, and actually blockchain is very heavily used currently in logistics. So this guy has real-world problems I'll talk about in a moment that can be helped with blockchain. And we'll talk about IBM and a shipping company called Maersk. They're using blockchain today. And a guy like this is very much interested because it's cutting his costs and helping satisfy his customers. The next persona is a security persona. And this persona is thinking about blockchain to secure personal identities, secure government documents, secure the Department of Defense, or worried about how hackers on the international hacking scene are using blockchain or blockchain-like technologies to potentially corrupt currencies, shift markets, or in other ways alter the strength of our economy here in the U.S. And then lastly is just somebody that I thought might, if you'll allow me the loose association, represent a brand owner or somebody working in the creative space who's kind of looking at this blockchain thing, maybe with one eye askew, what does it mean to me? So let's move down and let's really talk about that. Let's talk about a few real-world use cases and then find out if it's actually for the people on the phone. What are we doing with it and why are we doing it? So I've had on slide 15, Karina, I've got some companies that have real-world use cases for blockchain. Two I'll talk about. One is Maersk and IBM, and the other is De Beers Diamonds, that's a diamond company. And we can advance to the next slide now. So I mentioned the guy in operations and logistics, and what you see here is a graphic of a sea of containers that contain goods that are being shipped to and from Asia. And Karina, is it changed on your end? It hasn't changed on my end.
Yeah, it changed on my end.
Okay. You might give me a visual cue when that happens. An audio cue. So on my end, it hasn't yet, but as I said, I'm a little behind. So you've got all these containers being shipped from one person to another. Imagine the paperwork, laden bills, all of the customs work that has to be done between governments, the actual physical tracking of where is this? Oh, it's on the loading dock. Okay, it's on the ship. The ship is in the harbor. Ship's crossing the ocean. The ship is in the receiving harbor. Literally hundreds of sheets of paper that are being tracked on different systems rather than aligning them all in a single technology called blockchain. So Maersk and IBM are today tracking these shipping containers using blockchain technology. And again, I'll get into a little more in the how in a minute. And the next slide here is a slide that is essentially from the use case of blood diamonds, the concept that there are diamonds that we might have in Western society or Western culture that we bought at a diamond store. And in reality, cheap or even slave labor has been used to pull the diamonds out of the ground, to sort them from the agates, etc. So De Beers Diamond has created a blockchain tracking system for supply chain so that we can track the blockchain from the very moment that the agate was mined or pulled out of the river, a block of rocks, if you would, all the way into the retail environment so that we can find out when we buy the ring, did this ring use the wrong kind of labor? And the idea is that you would be able to experience in the De Beers Diamond store this, I don't know if it's today, but it's very soon, you could actually see the ownership and the chain. You still have to trust the source of information. Remember in the beginning I said not everybody trusts the company. So you could, and you would be justified in saying, well, how do I know De Beers is telling the truth? Maybe they just made up that this came from mine A instead of mine B. When you get into the implementation, it's all important as to who's participating and who's writing that data. On the next slide, we'll go to slide 18, Karina.
Mm-hmm.
And on the next slide, I'm just showing a list of all the different things. If you just order something on Amazon, to kind of emphasize all of the different kinds of data that might come along. So you put your order in, there's a request, there's a quote, you might use a credit card. Now the credit card company's involved. Somebody's got to go to a warehouse, have a picking list of what to pull, what box to put it on, what address to ship it to. Is it insured? Which shipper are we using? You can track it on your phone. Did it get there yet? And after you get it, think of the experience of that. Well, where's the instruction manual? I lost it, or I can't find it, or it's not for the right version. Where's my product warranty? Do I got to fill out one of those teeny little cards? Oh, I got to go on the internet and register it. All the stuff that happens to you, all the way to disposing it. It's got mercury in it, so I shouldn't throw it in the trash can. All of that data could actually be tracked in a single place and related to your original transaction. So in that example, you could go to Amazon and find out all of those documents, the entire life cycle of that purchase from one place. It could be Amazon or it could be another place. But the idea is there's probably a good 60 places that I could count. There's some data about products that I'm buying. And the reality today is it's all over the place, and I half the time can't find it, and when I do find it, I'm not positive it's right. A few more, on the next slide, a few more companies that have working prototypes of blockchain. These are companies you work with every day, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the people on the phone in some way have been involved in a blockchain test, either maybe by buying a drug at a Walgreens store or shopping at Amazon. I would not say blockchain is mainstream yet, but I would say there's real-world use cases. So let's take it to the next slide and now drill it down into brand marketing and talk about brand marketing. And the next slide says, how does this apply to brand marketing? And I thought the most important slide after that was a quote from Jeff Bezos. So if you can go to slide 21, Karina. Jeff Bezos' quote, I think this quote's about a year old, was your margin is my opportunity, meaning if you are making extra money or money that's higher than your cost in a business endeavor, that might be an endeavor that I'm going to come in and try to take advantage of. So one of the key questions, and the very first question you might ask with blockchain is, can I cut out an unnecessary step or a quote-unquote middleman, somebody who is just taking money from one person and handing it to another but not adding value to what I'm purchasing or experiencing? And so can that person be removed from the supply chain or from the purchasing cycle? And as I said, at the end of the talk here, we'll talk a little bit about how you can ask those questions. You can go next slide, Karina. So 3 areas that we're going to talk about for blockchain and marketing. The first one deals specifically with personal identity. So when you log into a system right now, probably the best login experience you might have is an iPhone or Samsung that checks your fingerprint and establishes with a high, not a perfect, but a high degree of certainty that you are who you say you are. We know that in the elections there are questions about social media and all these posts that were done. I believe most people in the country believe that Russians played with social media in some way and that the identities they purported to have were not their true personal identities. And so blockchain can come into play in terms of identifying social media people that are rating products, recommending products, turning down products, rating restaurants, etc. Blockchain has something to say about verifying that people that we read who have comments are who they say they are. The next segment is about multi-channel marketing. And in multi-channel marketing, we have a number of avenues. I think probably the one I've been thinking about the most is signage. So when you are a brand and you buy a, let's say, a national marketing campaign, you might be buying signs from different sign owners all around the country. And there may be an agency who's your buyer, your ad buyer, and that agency is collecting dollars from you and then doing the placements. And then sometimes a third party is monitoring the placements. So yes, brand X put down money in Seattle to run 16 signs next to an interstate for a month, and they pay the bill, but then they want to have somebody external verify that that ad was actually showing on that billboard next to that interstate. So blockchain is now starting to be discussed and used for monitoring, helping with the placement. I would say it's fair to say if you're on the phone and you're an agency that people are looking at, are agencies really bringing value to this process? Are they helping me buy the right space? Are they simply passing money from one place to another, i.e. is there margin and opportunity for disruption? And then the last one, the one I'll focus on for the rest of our talk this morning, or in my case afternoon, is about packaging and labeling. So let's move to slide 24, Karina. And this is the third use case.
There. We're there.
Has it switched for you?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And so in packaging and labeling, I've tried to represent the kind of data we use on a day-to-day basis and how it would be stored in a blockchain. So let's go to the next slide, slide 25. And each block we've represented graphically as a little box. And then on that box, there are a couple things. One is the data in the box. So I've represented data that might be in a block. And a block doesn't care what data is in. A block can hold a signature. A block can hold an image. It can hold a date and time stamp. It can hold a file. It can hold any kind of data that you want to move through the blockchain. And on the box, you'll see these little numbers, and these are called hashes. I'm going to talk about hashes in a moment. But the important thing here is that you've got these blocks. And if you were passing a file, let's say you created a file at a creative agency, and then it got passed maybe to a design firm to do some refinement, and then it got passed back to the brand for them to take a look at, and then maybe moved to a pre-media firm to do pre-press work and get it ready for printing, then back to the brand, and then finally to the printer. And you want to actually see that that's the same file all along the way, and you want to know who touched it and for how long. So if you thought of the file as being in the blockchain or maybe just a serial number of an individual file, so if you use Adobe Creative Cloud, every single file is using Illustrator or Photoshop or anywhere else with a global unique ID. And if you could follow that file and actually know in the supply chain where it went and you had a date stamp, a time stamp, and maybe who touched it or what firm, you could actually be able to track these files through the supply chain. This is part of Blue's mission, is to help people track, but having this immutable record, immutable meaning it can't be changed, it would be critical to applying blockchain to the art and labeling space. So I use this term hash, and unless you're a computer programmer, you may have heard and you may not be familiar with. Let's go to the next slide. Hash is a function. There's a technical description there, but I kind of just boiled it down to a hash takes data and creates a unique set of letters and numbers to represent the data. So you could take the Encyclopedia Britannica and run it through a hash algorithm, and it might come out with like 30 or 40 numbers and letters that represent the Encyclopedia Britannica. And if you changed one period somewhere on page 353 and ran that same hash algorithm, it would say it would be totally different. In other words, it takes the content and makes a little representation of it. And if anything in the content changes, that representation changes too. So there's a few things the hash needs to be. It needs to be deterministic, meaning that if I change that period in the encyclopedia, it will change the hash. We just talked about that one. It has to be non-invertible, so I can't take the little hash number and go backwards with it and come up with Encyclopedia Britannica. That's pretty easy to do because you're typically trimming the amount of information quite a lot. And then it needs to be efficient. I've got to be able to calculate it quickly because a lot of people are going to be calculating these blocks. So as an example, let's go to the next slide. I took a Photoshop file, and most of us have worked with Photoshop, and I just made it solid blue, and then I ran a hash on it. I'll show you the hash in a moment. And then I took the same file, and the only thing I did was change one pixel out of a million to a white pixel, and then I took that same pixel and made it a yellow pixel. So I've got this Photoshop with a million pixels. I've got three of them, and they have a teeny tiny difference, and then I ran a hash on them. So let's go to the next slide on the deck, and you'll see the three hashes. And there's different hash algorithms. The one I've kind of focused on is called the Havel, but different blockchains use different ones. They're really just different math formulas. You think back to algebra, x equals, 2x, y plus 4. It's an algorithm like that. And so on these hashes, and Karina, tell me when you're at the one with the red circles around the hashes. I think it's slide 30.
Yep, we're there.
Okay. So what I've got there is I've highlighted the hashes, and you'll see from the first file to the second file to the third file, they're totally different. They're totally different hashes, but what they've done is detected that the content has changed. So this is a really important concept. That means that if anybody makes the smallest change or says, I had a file with a white pixel, you go back and say, no, you didn't, because the hash I have is all blue pixels. In other words, the data is altered. Somebody's changed it. And that would mean it would break not only the block that we wrote, but it would break all the blocks after that. So it would invalidate the entire chain because somebody went back and tried to forge data in the middle of the chain. Again, a really important concept. Another way to think about it is if you have a line of relatives, you've got you and your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather and your great-great-grandfather. If somebody's tried to stick a person in and say, in between your great-great-grandfather and your great-great-great, there was this guy, you'd know it wasn't true if you had his DNA because you wouldn't have any of his DNA. You'd know it's fake. So that's another way to think about a broken chain using DNA as an example. So the last few slides here I want to get to because I think I'm running a little bit lower on time. On this, you can see the hashes at the end of one chain, the beginning of next. You've got to have a match between the hashes. And the hashes calculate not only the data inside the box, but they also use the hash of the preceding block to calculate. So again, you don't have to remember all that. Just remember, if somebody tried to stick a phony block in here or forge data, that the blockchain itself would invalidate it, and the community around it would go, that's fake, throw it out, and I'm going to regenerate a real one. Really important concept. There are some hurdles we'll talk about. So if you go on to slide 32, I've listed some hurdles. One is that if you've bought a Bitcoin or a Litecoin or any kind of digital currency, you have to have this thing called a PKI, or private key, and it's a string of numbers, and if you lose it, you can lose all your money, and it's not really friendly. It's something I could use as a technologist, but not something the average consumer could safely use. So there are some technologies called wallets that can help with this, but this is a hurdle. There's also interoperability.
Okay, are there?
Hi, it's John Clark here. So just to say, I think it was a very, very good presentation. So thank you, Stephen, for giving us that presentation. I'd be very interested to see more detail in the white papers around, obviously how this is impacting packaging, and based on, what you just said around changes to images and preserving files, and that's very, very key for data integrity. So it'd be good to see how that's coming along with Blue in the future, definitely.
Yeah, there's one area for pharmaceuticals in particular because they're so tied into audit trails, and even any vendor who has a audit trail may want to consider having that audit trail written to blockchain so that it is completely uneditable in the future. Right now, we put a lot of security around internets and do penetration testing and make sure people stay out of our clouds so they can't audit records, and that is an effective means. However, blockchain might even bring a more secure method to store audit data.
Stephen, we got a question through the chat, and it's how does a blockchain work with current ERP systems?
Yeah, so ERPs, they're large systems that handle corporate data, and typically they handle data from within the corporation. So if we think about ERPs, is there a trust problem? In other words, when I'm at a company and I'm logging an ERP system, do I trust the data? And from working with probably many of the people on the line and myself with ERP, the answer to that is not always yes. We'd like to think that all of the data across our corporation is always right. It's not always true. But I wouldn't say it'd be the first use case. I would say if multiple ERP systems are collecting data, so imagine manufacturing a product, and you need data from one ERP system from one company for some part and another ERP system from another, and you're aggregating ERPs, then there might be an idea to use blockchain to verify and store the data from multiple ERP systems so that when I use that aggregate data in my product, I can trust it, right? Think of chain of ownership. When you pick up something and put it into your mouth, you wonder, well, what field was this grown in and what pesticide was used and what trucking company took it, and did it spoil between the farm where it was raised and the store it got to. All that data is often ERP data. It might be a small vendor without ERP, or it might be ERP. If that gets aggregated into a database that has trust, maybe through a consortium, that can be a very powerful way to use blockchain and ERP. Does there need to be an arbiter that would need to verify the authenticity of the blockchain, or does this happen organically as a result of each secured transaction? So that partly depends on the private versus public blockchain. But one of the things we didn't talk about in blockchain is the decentralization of the computation. So if a number of parties, let's say 100 parties rather than 10,000, let's say 100 parties, each time a new block is submitted, the 99 other parties check it with the algorithms I mentioned to see if the rest of the chain is verified and if that block is verified. And there's two ways to go about that. One is called proof of stake, which means that each person calculating has a vested interest in the validity of the data. And then the other is proof of work. It just means I'm going to run so much power to make this block, and this is true in blockchain, that I wouldn't waste my time faking data. So, for example, every Bitcoin that's generated takes the equivalency of 16 gallons of gas. So the work, in a sense, is the arbiter that the person asked about. The community of people that are creating work around the blockchain create trust in the system. And that's a little bit of a harder concept to grasp.
Stephen, there's one more question. What impact will blockchain have with the dam?
Okay, I see it. Yes. So with DAM, I think that the technology is not efficient enough yet to actually store the assets in the blocks. So dams have assets that it can be a gig or more in size, and embedding a gigabyte Photoshop file of a poster and then running the hash against it is not a very efficient way to store it. But as I mentioned, if a dam had a serial number for every single asset in the dam, and then anybody who came and altered that asset, or if somebody downloaded it or then, let's say, altered it, re-uploaded it, and I could track. I had this trail of breadcrumbs of where every asset had been, not only in my dam, which is kind of available today, but what about each time somebody opened it in any Creative Cloud application that Adobe said, I've seen that asset before. I first saw it over in this Documentum dam, and then a week later I saw somebody open it up in their desktop in Creative Agency XYZ, and now I see it popped up because a pre-media firm just opened it up in Illustrator, even though it was originally a Photoshop file, et cetera. In other words, I could track its presence through the cloud, and that data could be put into the blockchain. I think that would have a very heavy impact on not only a single dam, but particularly interoperability across dams.